The crystal champagne flute felt like an extension of his own, triumphant soul, cold, sparkling, and filled to the brim with success. On stage, under the warm glow of 1,000 spotlights, Julian Aaron, the golden boy of Silicon Valley, raised his glass. Beside him, the stunning Isabella Rossi, his VP, and his secret mirrored the gesture. He was about to toast to his future, to their future. But in the vast, adoring crowd, a single color broke the sea of black and silver, a flash of crimson. As Julian's eyes focused, the color took shape: a woman in a red gown, her silhouette unmistakable, her presence an impossible, terrifying reality. His pregnant wife. Julian Aaron lived a life meticulously curated for the pages of Forbes and Fortune. His sprawling Marin County home, a masterpiece of glass and redwood overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, was a testament to his genius. He was the founder and CEO of Ether Innovations, a tech behemoth whose latest product, Ether Connect, promised to revolutionize global communication. At 38, he had a jawline that photographers loved, a mind that venture capitalists adored, and a wife who was the living embodiment of grace and old money elegance, Eleanor Aaron. Eleanor was more than just a beautiful accessory. In the early days, when Ether was just a chaotic dream operating out of a garage, her inheritance had been the seed money. Her unwavering belief had been the foundation. While Julian was the architect and the showman, Eleanor was the silent engineer of his life, ensuring every cog in their domestic and social machinery turned without a squeak. Now she was 7 months pregnant with their first child, a son. It was supposed to be the final perfect piece of their perfect life. But perfection was a fragile veneer. For the past year, the foundation had been cracking, eroded by the slow, corrosive drip of deceit. The late nights at the office became more frequent, the business trips longer. The easy intimacy they once shared was replaced by a polite, aching distance. Julian would come home smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers. Chanel No. 5, a classic, bold choice. So unlike Eleanor's subtle, bespoke lily-of-the-valley scent. The source of that scent was Isabella Rossi. Isabella was the anti-Eleanor. Where Eleanor was classic elegance, Isabella was modern fire. Hired as the VP of marketing, she was a whirlwind of ambition with sharp intelligence and a predatory grace. She saw the world not in terms of relationships, but of acquisitions. And she had set her sights on acquiring Julian Aaron and the empire he commanded. Their affair hadn't been a sordid, cheap motel tryst. It was an affair conducted in penthouse suites in Tokyo, in private jets over the Atlantic, and in the hushed, minimalist conference rooms of Ether headquarters after everyone else had gone home. To Julian, it felt like a jolt of electricity, a validation of the titan he saw himself as. Isabella didn't need his support. She mirrored his ambition. She didn't talk about nursery colors or obstetrician appointments. She talked about market caps and hostile takeovers. She was, he foolishly convinced himself, his true intellectual equal. Eleanor, however, was no fool. She wasn't the type to rifle through pockets or check phone records. Her evidence was more visceral. It was in the way Julian's eyes would flick to his phone when a notification chimed, the way he stopped telling her about the details of his day, replacing specifics with vague, empty summaries. The final damning piece of evidence came not from a discovery, but from an omission. The Ether Gala. It was the biggest night in the company's history, the official launch of Ether Connect. For months, it had been all Julian talked about. Eleanor had her gown ready, a custom silver-blue creation by a renowned designer, designed to accommodate her growing baby bump with ethereal grace. 2 days before the event, Julian had come to her, his expression a practiced mask of concern. "Ellie, my love," he began, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Dr. Marlowe called me. He said with the stress of this final trimester, a big crowded event like the gala might be too much for you. He strongly advised you stay home and rest." Eleanor had simply nodded, her heart turning to a block of ice. She knew her obstetrician, Dr. Marlowe, personally. He was an old family friend. He would never call her husband behind her back unless the situation was dire, and even then he would have insisted she be on the line. A single discreet call to the doctor's office confirmed her suspicion. "No, Eleanor, I haven't spoken to Julian at all this week. Is everything all right?" the nurse had replied, her voice laced with innocent confusion. The lie was so blatant, so carelessly cruel, that it shattered the last vestiges of hope she'd been clinging to. He didn't just want to hide his affair. He wanted to erase her. He wanted to stand on that stage on the night of his greatest triumph, a triumph she had funded and emotionally supported, and have his mistress by his side, while his pregnant wife was tucked away, silenced and invisible. That evening, as Julian packed his tuxedo, believing his deception had worked, Eleanor sat in her walk-in closet, the silver-blue gown hanging before her like a ghost of the life she thought she had. Her hand rested on her belly, where their son kicked gently. It wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of war. And Eleanor Aaron, for all her quiet grace, had never been one to surrender. She calmly picked up her phone and made a call, not to a friend for comfort, but to a different kind of confidant. "Amelia," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I need a dress. I need it by tomorrow night. It needs to be red, the color of courage and of warning, the color of blood." The grand ballroom of the Fairmont San Francisco was transformed into a celestial wonderland. The theme for the Ether Gala was Connecting Worlds, and the event designers had spared no expense. Thousands of fiber-optic lights twinkled in the ceiling like a captured galaxy. Holographic projections of nebulas and constellations drifted through the air. The city's elite were all their tech billionaires in their signature non-tuxedos, venture capitalists with predatory smiles, politicians and socialites draped in jewels. The air hummed with power money and the intoxicating promise of the future. At the center of it all was Julian Aaron. He moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a king in his court. He shook hands. He laughed, his charisma, a gravitational force pulling everyone into his orbit. On his arm, for all intents and purposes, was Isabella Rossi. She was breathtaking in a gown of liquid black sequins that clung to her like a second skin, a stark dramatic contrast to the celestial theme. They were a power couple in the making, and the knowing glances and whispered comments from the attendees confirmed it. "The real CEO," one journalist muttered to another. "She's the driving force behind this launch." Julian heard none of it, or perhaps chose to ignore it. He was high on the energy of the room, on the culmination of a decade of relentless work. He felt invincible. He'd sent Eleanor a text an hour ago. "Thinking of you, my love. Rest well. Wish you could be here." The hypocrisy didn't even register. His mind had compartmentalized his life so effectively that the guilt was locked away in a soundproof room, leaving him free to bask in his glory. He's completely besotted. Marcus Thorne, Ether's CFO, and Julian's oldest friend, observed quietly to his wife. Marcus was a quiet, steady man, the antithesis of Julian's flash. He'd watched his friend's transformation from a brilliant, driven idealist into this arrogant stranger with a growing sense of unease. He'd also seen the furtive touches between Julian and Isabella, the shared glances that held far too much meaning. He worried for Eleanor, whom he deeply respected. "It's a train wreck waiting to happen," his wife whispered back, sipping her champagne. The preliminary speeches were made. The mayor praised Ether for its contribution to the city's economy. A celebrity investor spoke glowingly of Julian's vision. Then the lights dimmed further, and a dramatic overture began to play. A single brilliant spotlight hit the center of the grand stage. It was time for the main event. Julian strode onto the stage to thunderous applause. He stood at the podium, a figure of absolute power and success. He began his speech, his voice resonating with passion. He spoke of innovation, of breaking barriers of a future where distance was meaningless. He was a master orator, weaving a narrative that held the audience captive. EtherConnect is more than just a product. He boomed, his arms outstretched. It is a promise of a smaller, more intimate world. But a vision like this is not born in a vacuum. It requires a partner. Someone who shares the vision, who challenges you, who pushes you to be better than you ever thought you could be. Someone who is not just a colleague, but a true counterpart in spirit and ambition. A murmur went through the crowd. This was an unusual turn. He was expected to thank his team, his investors. This felt personal. In the wings, Isabella preened. This was it. The moment she'd been working towards. He was going to publicly acknowledge her, to elevate her from employee to partner in front of the most influential people in their world. It was better than a ring. It was a coronation. Julian's eyes scanned the front row, deliberately avoiding Marcus's worried gaze. His mind flashed to Eleanor, safe at home. A tiny, insignificant flicker of guilt, quickly extinguished by the roaring fire of his ego. He rationalized it. Eleanor was from a different world, a softer, quieter world. She wouldn't understand this triumph. Not really. But Isabella was forged in the same fire he was. "Tonight," Julian continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, intimate tone, "I want to share this moment with that indispensable partner, a person whose brilliance and dedication were the crucible in which EtherConnect was perfected. Please join me on stage. The brilliant mind behind our entire global launch strategy, Isabella Rossi." The applause was deafening as Isabella ascended the stage, her black gown shimmering. She moved with a feline grace, her eyes locked on Julian's, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. He took her hand, the gesture far too familiar for a CEO and his VP. An assistant scurried on stage, handing them 2 freshly poured glasses of champagne. Julian turned to face the audience, raising his glass high. Isabella stood beside him, her arm linked through his. They were a portrait of ultimate success. "So I ask you all to join us." Julian's voice rang out clear and proud. "Let's toast to the future, to EtherConnect, and to the partnerships that make the impossible possible." He turned to Isabella, their eyes meeting. The world seemed to melt away, the applause a distant roar. This was his summit. This was his victory. He clinked his glass against hers, the clear, crystalline sound echoing through the ballroom. And it was in that exact crystal-clear moment of triumphant sound, as he brought the glass to his lips, that the grand oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung silently open. The change in the room was not instantaneous. It was a slow, creeping wave of awareness that started at the back and rolled forward, silencing the applause row by row. Heads began to turn, conversations faltered, and a confused murmur replaced the celebratory roar. Julian, cocooned in his moment of triumph on stage, was one of the last to notice. He saw the shift in the audience's gaze, their eyes no longer on him, but on something behind him, something at the entrance. A frown creased his brow. He glanced at Isabella, who looked equally perplexed, her smile tightening at the edges. He turned, and his world stopped. Framed in the magnificent archway of the ballroom doors stood a figure. At first, it was just the color that registered a searing, defiant red. It was a color that didn't belong in the cool, celestial palette of the gala. It was the color of a siren, of an open wound, of a declaration. As his eyes adjusted to the distance, the figure resolved itself into a woman. It was Eleanor. She was not the subdued, gently elegant Eleanor he had left at home. The woman standing there was a queen. She wore a floor-length custom-made gown of deep crimson silk. The fabric was deceptively simple, with clean, powerful lines that draped exquisitely over her 7-month pregnancy, accentuating the curve of her belly rather than hiding it. It made her look not fragile, but formidable, like a vessel of life and righteous fury. Her hair, usually styled in soft waves, was swept up in a severe, regal chignon, exposing the proud line of her neck. Her makeup was minimal but stark, a bold red lip that matched the dress. She was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Julian had ever seen. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a physical pressure that sucked the air from the room. The only sound was the faint ambient music from the speakers, which now seemed hideously out of place. Every eye, hundreds of them, was locked on Eleanor as she stood perfectly still at the entrance. On stage, Julian froze. The practiced, charismatic smile dissolved from his face, replaced by a slack-jawed mask of disbelief and horror. The champagne flute, which seconds ago had felt like a scepter, now felt impossibly heavy in his hand. His mind scrambled, trying to process the scene. Why she was supposed to be at home. She was supposed to be resting. The lie he had told her, so convenient and simple, was now a ticking bomb that had just detonated in the center of his life. Beside him, Isabella's confusion morphed into dawning comprehension, and then into pure, unadulterated fury. Her fingers tightened on Julian's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fabric of his tuxedo. She recognized Eleanor instantly, of course. She had studied photographs of her, dissecting her rival's style, her looks, her life. But the woman in the pictures was a pale imitation of the avenging angel in red, who now commanded the attention of the entire room. Isabella's moment, her public anointing, had been stolen. The champagne glass in Julian's hand trembled, the golden liquid sloshing over the rim and onto his fingers, cold as ice. His throat was dry. He tried to form a word, Eleanor's name, an explanation, anything, but no sound came out. He was a statue, a monument to his own spectacular downfall, captured in the glare of the spotlights he had so desperately craved. And then Eleanor moved. Her steps were slow, deliberate, and utterly silent on the plush carpet. She didn't rush. She didn't look flustered or hysterical. She had a ronde with the inexorable calm purpose of a tidal wave. Her eyes were fixed on the stage, on the two figures bathed in light. She didn't look at the whispering guests or the gawking journalists, their phones now surreptitiously raised to record the unfolding drama. She looked only at her husband and the woman standing beside him. With every step she took, the invisible thread of tension in the room pulled tighter. The story was no longer about a tech launch. It was about this silent, magnificent, and terrible procession. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic. Do something, say something, his mind screamed. But what could he say? What could he possibly do? Run off the stage, pretend she wasn't there? Every possible action seemed more catastrophic than the last. He was trapped, impaled by the spotlight and her unwavering gaze. The crystal flute finally slipped from his numb fingers. It didn't shatter. It hit the stage with a dull, heavy thud, rolling a few inches before coming to a stop in a small, spreading pool of champagne. The sound, small as it was like a gunshot in the cavernous silence. It was the sound of the end. Eleanor's walk down the long center aisle of the ballroom was a masterclass in psychological warfare. She held the gaze of every single person she passed, yet her focus remained laser-sharp on the stage. The whispers followed in her wake, a ripple of shock and speculation. That's Eleanor Aaron. My God, she's pregnant. What is she doing here? Look at Julian's face. The socialites who had pitied her, the business rivals who envied her husband, the journalists who smelled blood in the water, they were all her audience now. And she was giving them the performance of a lifetime. This wasn't the act of a woman scorned, come to scream and make a scene. This was the arrival of a reckoning. As she reached the front of the room, she finally paused at the foot of the low, broad steps leading up to the stage. She was now close enough to see the beads of sweat on Julian's forehead, the panicked tremor in his hand. She could see the venom in Isabella's eyes, the possessive grip she still had on Julian's arm, as if she could physically hold their shared world together through sheer force of will. Isabella, recovering from her initial shock, leaned in and hissed at Julian. Her voice, a venomous whisper, meant only for him. Get her out of here. Julian, do something. This is a disaster. Call security. Have her removed. Her words seemed to break Julian's paralysis. He took a half step forward, his mouth opening. Eleanor. He began, his voice a hoarse croak. He intended to say more, to perhaps ask what she was doing, to plead with her to leave, to handle this privately. But Eleanor didn't give him the chance. She raised a single graceful hand, not in a wave, but in a clear, commanding gesture to stop. And he did. The one word he had managed to utter hung in the air, pathetic and useless. With the entire room as her witness, Eleanor looked not at her husband, but directly at Isabella Rossi. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not loud, but it was so clear and resonant that it carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. It was a voice stripped of all warmth, polished to a diamond-hard edge. Miss Rossi, she said, the formal address a deliberate, calculated insult. You are holding my husband's arm. Please let it go. The audacity of the demand, so polite, yet so utterly dominant, sent another shock wave through the audience. Isabella flinched, as if struck. Her face, a mask of fury, flushed a deep, ugly red beneath her perfect makeup. For a moment, her grip on Julian's arm tightened, a defiant act of possession. But then she saw the expressions on the faces in the front row. Pity, disgust, morbid curiosity. She was being judged, and she was losing. Her claim, staked in secret, was dissolving under the public glare of a lawful wife. With a final convulsive jerk, she released Julian's arm, stepping back as if his touch had burned her. Julian stood between the two women, a pathetic, powerless figurehead. His empire, his night, his life, it was all being decided for him. Eleanor's gaze then shifted to Julian. The cold fury in her eyes was so intense it was almost a physical force. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to list his sins. He saw them all reflected back at him in her unwavering stare, the lies, the betrayal, the staggering disrespect. He saw the ghost of the man he once was, and the monster he had become. "Julian," she said, her voice still unnervingly calm, "you gave a toast to partnership, to the people who make the impossible possible. I believe you forgot to thank someone." A nervous titter went through the crowd. This was better than theatre. This was a public execution, and Eleanor was the most elegant executioner they had ever seen. Without waiting for his response, she turned slightly, addressing the audience directly. She was no longer just the wife. She was taking command of the stage, even from the floor. "My name is Eleanor Aaron. For those of you who don't know me, I am more than Julian's wife. I am the first investor in Ether Innovations, the seed money that built the prototype for the technology you are all celebrating tonight came from my inheritance, a fact that is often omitted from the company's official history." The murmurs grew louder. This wasn't just a domestic dispute. This was a business matter. Marcus Thorne, the CFO, closed his eyes from his seat in the front row. He knew what was coming. He had tried to warn Julian for months that neglecting Eleanor was not just a moral failing, but a catastrophic business risk. Eleanor began to ascend the stage, one slow, deliberate step at a time. The crimson silk of her gown whispered against the stairs. She was no longer an apparition at the door. She was claiming her rightful space, moving towards the center of power. She reached the top of the stairs and stood on the same level as her husband. She was a few inches shorter than him, but at that moment she towered over him. She walked past him, giving him only a passing dismissive glance, and stopped directly at the podium, placing her hands firmly on its sides, as if she owned it. Because, as she was about to reveal, she did. Eleanor stood at the podium, the warmth of the spotlight feeling less like an interrogation and more like an anointing. She took a moment, her gaze sweeping across the sea of stunned faces, from the powerful investors in the front row to the anxious company employees in the back. She appeared perfectly composed, a stark contrast to Julian, who looked like a man whose skeleton had been removed, and Isabella, who was radiating a palpable aura of hate from the edge of the stage. "Thank you, Julian, for the introduction I was never meant to have," Eleanor began. Her voice amplified by the microphone, clear and devoid of any tremor. He spoke of partnership, of vision, and he is right. Ether Connect was born from a partnership, but it was not the one he so publicly celebrated moments ago. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. 15 years ago, when Ether was just a concept scribbled on napkins in a Palo Alto coffee shop, Julian had a brilliant idea for the hardware. But an idea for a network is useless without the network itself. It needed a language, a core operational logic that could handle data packets with unprecedented speed and security. It needed a soul. Julian's face had gone from pale to ashen. He knew this story. He knew it as well as he knew his own name. But it was a story he had systematically erased from the corporate narrative, a truth he had buried under years of his own self-aggrandizement. "That soul," Eleanor continued, her voice ringing with an authority no one in that room had ever heard from her, "is a proprietary encryption and transmission algorithm, an algorithm that I wrote." A collective gasp went through the ballroom. It was one thing for her to be the first investor. That was a role many wealthy wives played. But to be the creator of the core technology, that was a game changer. It was a corporate earthquake. "My degree is in computational linguistics, and ad aurand cryptography, she stated, preempting the disbelief. Before I became Mrs. Aaron, I was Eleanor Reed, and I was considered one of the most promising minds in my field. I put my career on hold to support my husband's, a decision I made out of love. But I never stopped working. The foundational code of EtherConnect, the very thing that makes it unique and marketable, is my intellectual property. Isabella Rossi let out a short, sharp laugh of disbelief. That's absurd, she spat, her voice shrill. You're a housewife. You plan parties. You're lying. Eleanor didn't even turn to look at her. She simply continued as if she hadn't heard. Of course, a claim like that requires proof. It's so easy to dismiss a woman's work, isn't it? To relegate her to the role of supporter or muse. She reached into a small, elegant crimson clutch bag that had been hanging from her wrist. From it, she pulled out a folded set of documents and a sleek silver USB drive. She placed them on the podium with a definitive click. On this drive, she announced, are the original time-stamped code repositories from my private servers dating back 12 years. Here, she patted the papers, are the patent applications for the Reed-Aaron asymmetrical encryption key. You'll notice my maiden name is listed first as lead inventor. These were filed and granted 8 years ago, long before EtherConnect was even a brand name. They were held in a private trust waiting for the right moment. She finally turned her head and looked at Julian, a sliver of something that might have been sorrow, but was now cold steel in her eyes. I trusted you, Julian. I trusted that you would do the right thing and formally license the technology from the trust when the company went public, that you would acknowledge my contribution. I thought our marriage, our partnership was built on something more than just your ego. I was wrong. The implications of her words began to dawn on the investors in the front row. If the core technology of the company's flagship product was not owned by the company, but by a private individual, an individual the CEO had just publicly and catastrophically betrayed, then Aether Innovations was built on a lie. Their multi-billion-dollar valuation was a house of cards. You can't do this, Julian whispered, finally finding his voice. It was a plea. Eleanor, please, we can talk about this, not here. We are long past talking. Julian, she said, her voice dropping, becoming dangerously quiet. You made this public. You chose this stage to humiliate me, to erase me, and to replace me. You don't get to choose a different venue now. You wanted the spotlight. Then you will stand here in the light and face the truth of what you have done. She turned back to the audience. So when my husband toasts to partnership, he should be toasting to me. He should be toasting to the woman who funded his dream and then created the very heart of it. The woman he thought was resting quietly at home so that his mistress could stand in the spotlight that rightfully belonged to his wife and his partner. Her hand went to her belly, a gesture that was both maternal and fiercely protective, and to the mother of his son. The last 4 words struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his hand flying to his chest as if he could somehow stop his heart from beating out of it. The affair, the lie, the corporate theft. It all paled in comparison to this single, devastating truth. He hadn't just betrayed his wife and partner. He had betrayed his unborn child. The revelation of Eleanor's intellectual property was a bomb. But she hadn't come to just scorch the earth. She had come to raise the entire kingdom. The silence that followed her declaration was heavy, thick with the smell of financial ruin. Investors were no longer looking at Julian with awe, but with the cold, calculating eyes of men who felt their fortunes evaporating. Isabella Rossi, however, was a fighter. Her ambition was a cornered animal, and it was lashing out. "This is a farce," she shouted from the side of the stage, stepping forward again. "A desperate, pathetic attempt by a scorned woman to ruin a great man. Ether Innovations has a team of the best engineers in the world. The code is ours. She's delusional." Eleanor turned to her, slowly, a look of profound pity on her face. "Miss Rossi, you are a marketer. A very good one, I'll admit. Your campaign for Ether Connect has been brilliant. But you are out of your depth. You speak of things you do not understand. And more than that, you have been remarkably careless." Eleanor's gaze shifted from Isabella back to the audience. "You see, a company's health isn't just about its technology. It's also about its finances. It's about integrity, about accountability." She gestured towards the front row. "Marcus, would you join me, please?" Marcus Thorne, the stoic CFO, stood up. His face was grim, etched with a deep sadness, but also with resolve. He had made his choice. Loyalty to a friend did not extend to abetting a crime. He walked to the stage steps, not with the triumphant stride of a conspirator, but with the heavy tread of a man doing a necessary, painful duty. He carried a slim leather portfolio. Julian's eyes widened in utter betrayal. "Marcus, what are you doing? Don't do this." Marcus didn't look at him. He walked straight to Eleanor and handed her the portfolio. "As requested, Eleanor. The quarterly marketing expenditure reports cross-referenced with the off-books vendor accounts." Eleanor took the portfolio and opened it on the podium. "Miss Rossi's brilliant global launch strategy was not just aggressive, it was also in parts fraudulent. It involved the creation of several shell marketing corporations registered offshore. These corporations would bill Ether for services never rendered or at grotesquely inflated prices. The excess funds were then funneled into a private account." She looked directly at Isabella, whose face had gone from red with anger to a ghastly, waxy white. "An account in the Cayman Islands under the name IR Enterprises. An account that has seen deposits totaling over $9 million in the last 6 months alone." The crowd erupted. This was no longer a domestic drama or a patent dispute. This was outright corporate fraud, embezzlement. "It was your escape plan, wasn't it, Isabella?" Eleanor's voice was like ice. "You weren't just sleeping with the CEO. You were robbing his company blind. Did you think you would bleed Ether dry and then convince Julian to run away with you, leaving the wreckage behind? Or was your plan to expose him, use this as leverage and seize control of the board yourself?" Isabella was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She looked at Julian, her eyes screaming for him to deny it to save her. But Julian was a broken man. He was staring at Marcus, his oldest friend. "Marcus, why?" he choked out. Marcus finally met his gaze, his own eyes filled with a weary disappointment. "I warned you, Julian. I told you the marketing budgets were out of control. I told you the numbers didn't add up. You told me to trust Isabella's genius and to make it work. You stopped listening to me. You stopped listening to anyone but her. But my signature is on those SEC filings. My duty is to the company and its shareholders, not to your ego. Eleanor came to me a week ago. She already suspected. She had seen the patterns. She just needed confirmation. I gave it to her." This was the final fatal twist of the knife. It wasn't just his wife who had turned on him. It was his conscience, his moral compass personified in his best friend. Eleanor closed the portfolio with a soft final snap. "So you see, we have 2 major problems. The company's core technology is my private intellectual property, which as of this moment, I am formally revoking all implied licenses for its use. EtherConnect cannot legally be sold. And 2, the company is the victim of significant fraud, orchestrated by the very executive my husband chose to honor tonight, with at best his gross negligence and at worst his complicity. She turned, and as if on cue, a man in a sharp, dark suit, who had been standing discreetly by the ballroom entrance, began to walk forward, accompanied by 2 other stern-faced individuals. "This is my attorney, Mr. Davies," Eleanor announced calmly. "He will be handling the patent injunction and my formal petition to the board for an emergency audit and the immediate removal of Julian Aaron as CEO. He will also be handing over Marcus's findings to the SEC and the District Attorney's Office tomorrow morning." The attorney reached the stage and stood beside Eleanor, a silent, imposing figure. The dream of Ether Innovations was dead. The gala had become its funeral. Isabella Rossi, finally realizing the totality of her ruin, let out a strangled sob and turned, stumbling off the stage and pushing blindly through the crowd, a pariah seeking an escape that no longer existed. Julian Aaron did not move. He simply stood there, a hollow man in a spotlight surrounded by the smoking ruins of the empire he had built and the life he had so carelessly destroyed. He looked at Eleanor, at the magnificent, terrible woman in the red dress carrying his son, who had just dismantled his entire world with nothing but the truth, and for the first time in a very long time he saw her. He truly saw the force of nature he had betrayed, and he knew with chilling certainty that he deserved every second of it. The chaos that followed Eleanor's departure was not a wave, but a detonation. The moment the grand oak doors closed behind her, the spell of stunned silence shattered into a million sharp-edged pieces. The room, which had been a cathedral of hushed tension, transformed into a frantic, churning pit of noise. The clicking of smartphone cameras became a deafening insect-like swarm. Journalists, no longer feigning decorum, surged toward the stage like a pack of wolves, shouting questions that were less inquiries and more accusations. "Mr. Aaron, can you confirm Ether's core patent is not company property? Is it true you were complicit in a multi-million-dollar fraud? What is your response to your wife's allegations?" On stage, Julian stood catatonic. The spotlights that had been his adoring son now feeling like the merciless lights of an interrogation room. His world had been deconstructed, piece by piece, in front of everyone he had ever wanted to impress. His attorney, a shark named Lawrence Adler, whom Julian paid an obscene retainer to make problems disappear, was now the one who looked panicked. He was whispering frantically into his phone, his eyes darting between Julian and Eleanor's calm, collected lawyer, Mr. Davies, who stood like a stone monolith, unmoved by the hysteria. Adler was a fixer, but he couldn't fix this. This was a demolition. Julian's eyes found Marcus Thorne, who was being shielded from the press by his wife as they made their way toward a side exit. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second across the chaotic room. There was no anger left in Julian, only a hollow, cavernous bewilderment. In Marcus's eyes he saw no triumph, only a deep, profound sorrow, the look of a man who had just performed a painful but necessary amputation on a part of his own life. Then he was gone. The most visceral drama, however, was Isabella Rossi's desperate, ignominious flight. Her sprint from the stage was not an exit, but an escape. She pushed through the throngs of elegantly dressed guests, her sequined gown, once a symbol of her sleek power, now catching the light in mocking flashes as she scrambled away. A ruthless blogger shoved a phone in her face, its light a cruel parody of the spotlight she had craved. "Isabella," "How does it feel to be the most hated woman in Silicon Valley?" The voice sneered. She flinched, knocking the phone away with a choked sob, and ran not towards an exit, but blindly a moth fleeing a fire. It had started disappearing into the labyrinthine corridors of the hotel. Her coronation had become a public stoning. Julian was finally led off the stage by a bewildered security detail and his frantic lawyer. He moved like a puppet, with its strings cut his limbs heavy, his eyes vacant. They didn't take him through the crowd, but through the back, past roadie cases and sound equipment, the unglamorous guts of the event. Just minutes ago, he was the king. Now he was being shuffled out the servants' entrance of his own palace. The last thing he heard before the fire door slammed shut behind him was the unified roar of the digital vultures feasting on the carcass of his reputation. The ensuing 24 hours were a masterclass in corporate collapse. Before the sun rose over the bay, the story was the global headline on every financial news network. The phrase, "the woman in the red dress," was trending worldwide. Ether Innovations stock, a darling of the Nasdaq, was in absolute freefall in pre-market trading in Frankfurt and Tokyo. The board of directors, scattered across the globe, convened an emergency video conference at 3 a.m. Pacific time. It was a short, brutal meeting. Marcus Thorne, his face grim on a dozen screens, presented the irrefutable evidence of Isabella's shell corporations and the dangerously ambiguous legal standing of their core technology. But Davies, representing Eleanor's interests, joined the call to deliver the terms. They were not a negotiation. They were an unconditional surrender. An immediate injunction would be filed against the sale and distribution of any product using the Reed-Aaron algorithm unless a new licensing agreement was reached with a new leadership. The implication was clear. Julian Aaron had to go. Not in a week, not by the end of the day. Now. Julian was summoned. He appeared on screen from a sterile hotel room his lawyer had secured, looking like a ghost in his own machine. The tuxedo was gone, replaced by a wrinkled shirt. His face was a pallid mask of sleeplessness. He tried to speak, to defend himself, to appeal to the board members. He had hand-picked men he had made rich. But his charisma was gone, incinerated in the blaze of his public humiliation. His words were hollow, pathetic. The board, a panel of ruthless capitalists, saw not a leader in a crisis, but a catastrophic liability. The vote for his immediate termination was unanimous. He was officially severed from his own creation before he'd even had a chance to drink a cup of coffee. Isabella Rossi's reckoning was even swifter. Tipped off by an anonymous source, likely Marcus Thorne, ensuring no loose ends, the FBI was waiting for her at San Francisco International Airport. They found her at the gate for Emirates flight EK226 to Dubai, a destination conveniently lacking an extradition treaty with the United States. She was trying to blend in, wearing oversized sunglasses and a simple tracksuit, a pathetic disguise for a woman who had lived her life demanding to be seen. The federal agents were quiet, professional. They flanked her as she tried to check in their badges, flashing discreetly. "Isabella Rossi, you need to come with us." Her final desperate gambit for freedom ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, definitive click of handcuffs on her wrists. In the weeks that followed, the world sorted itself into two distinct realities. For Julian, it was a descent into a silent, isolating hell. He was a pariah. His calls went unanswered. His invitations were rescinded. He was forced to sell his shares in Ether at a devastating loss to cover his impending legal fees and the initial demands of the divorce settlement. The glass house in Marin County, a monument to his success, was sold. He moved into a soulless high-rise condo, in a city where no one knew his face, a sarcophagus of glass and steel. He would spend hours scrolling through the news, watching the woman he had discarded become a global icon of empowerment. He saw articles praising Eleanor's business acumen, her quiet strength. She wasn't portrayed as a vengeful wife, but as the company's rightful, brilliant founder finally taking her place. He had tried to erase her, and in the end, the world had erased him instead. He hadn't just lost his company and his wife. He had lost his very story. For Eleanor, it was a period of profound and purposeful quiet. She retreated from the world not to hide, but to prepare. She moved into her family's old, sprawling estate in Carmel, a place of whispering pines and crashing waves, a world away from the toxic ambition of Silicon Valley. Surrounded by a small, fiercely loyal staff and her family, she focused on the final weeks of her pregnancy. She didn't revel in Julian's downfall or Isabella's arrest. Her actions had not been about passion or revenge. They had been a series of calculated strategic moves to protect her future and the legacy she had created. While the world debated her motives, she was simply quietly getting her house in order. 6 weeks after the gala of ruin, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy 7-pound baby boy. In the quiet, sunlit room of the maternity ward, holding her son for the first time, the last vestiges of the battle she had endured fell away. She looked into his tiny, perfect face and saw not a connection to a broken past, but the foundation of an entirely new future. She named him Reed. Her name. A name that signified strength, resilience, and a legacy that was hers, and hers alone to give. The phoenix truly rose from the ashes 2 months later. Eleanor Aaron, now majority shareholder and newly appointed chairwoman of the board of Ether Innovations, walked into the company's headquarters. There was no fanfare. She wore a simple, elegant, navy blue dress, the color of stability and command. She convened an all-hands meeting, standing before the thousands of employees whose futures had been thrown into turmoil. Her speech was everything Julian's had not been. It was quiet, direct, and profoundly honest. She acknowledged the betrayal and the fraud at the highest level of the company. She did not gloss over the painful truth. But then she pivoted. She spoke of her own history with the company not as a wife, but as its first architect. She laid out a new vision for Ether, one built not on reckless growth and bloated egos, but on sustainable innovation, transparency, and a culture of mutual respect. With Marcus Thorne formally appointed as her CEO, they began the Great Reconstruction. They dissolved the toxic high-pressure sales departments and replaced them with collaborative, product-focused teams. They established a new independent ethics committee. They invested heavily in employee wellness programs. They began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding trust with shareholders and the public, not with slick marketing campaigns, but with solid, dependable performance. Eleanor didn't just save the company. She gave it a soul, the one she had written the code for all those years ago. Julian Aaron was never heard from again in any meaningful way. His name became a verb in the valley. To be Aaroned was to suffer a complete and total self-inflicted public immolation. He existed only as a ghost, a cautionary tale. Eleanor never wore red again. She didn't need to. The red dress had been a weapon for a single, decisive battle. But the war for her life, for her legacy, and for her future had been won. Her power was no longer something she had to wear. It was in the code she wrote the company she led, and the quiet, steady gaze of the son who bore her name. She had walked into the fire of her husband's betrayal, and emerged not burned, but forged. The story of Eleanor Aaron isn't just about a marriage ending. It's about a woman refusing to have her life's work and her identity erased. She walked into that gala, not to reclaim her husband, but to reclaim herself. Her red dress wasn't a plea for attention. It was her armor, a symbol that she would not break, that she would not be silenced. She reminds us that the deepest betrayals often come from those closest to us, but our greatest strength is found when we decide to stop being a victim and become the architect of our own justice. It's a raw and powerful lesson in self-worth and the courage it takes to burn down a world built on lies, to build a new one founded on truth. What did you think of Eleanor's incredible moment? Was she right to do it so publicly? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story as compelling as I did, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more true life dramas.